Serfdom, the status of peasants and lower-class people under feudalism, in which they were forced to work for lord's manor with little rights. Feudalism, structure of medieval societies, where the landowner lords controlled the political and economic relationships of society by giving protection to peasants' serfs and exploiting their labor. Capitalism, a mode of production that depends on private property and accumulation of profit through market exchanges. Monarchy, a form of government, in which a single ruler holds all political power over the society. Monarchs change through a hereditary rule, mostly in a single family. Marxism is a theory and method for working-class emancipation through socializing the means of production. Aims to end private property's power over social relationships. Civil society, it generally refers to the sections of society and their political, economic activities, which are independent from government. V.I. Lenin, Russian revolutionary and leader of the October Revolution in 1917. He served as the head of Soviet government until 1924. Vanguard Party, in Leninist theory, Communist Party should form the vanguard of the working class and lead them in revolutionary struggles. Bolsheviks, dominant section of Marxist Russian Social Democratic Party, split from reformist Mensheviks. Soviets, in Russian, it means the revolutionary councils that formed the governmental foundation of the Soviet Union during October Revolution. Socialism, an economic system that is characterized by social ownership of means of production and workers' self-management. J. Stalin, second leader of the Soviet Communist Party, served through 1924 to 1953 and renowned for his idea of socialism in a single country. Comecon, Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, an institution that was made of 7 East European countries and USSR. It lasted from 1949 to 1991. Lech Walesa, Polish retired politician and labor activist. Founder of the trade union Solidarity in 1980s. Served as President of Poland between 1990 to 1995. Mikhail Gorbachev, 8th and the last General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, and the last leader of the USSR. Glasnost and Perestroika, Gorbachev's reform for political and economic liberalization and transparency in the 1980s USSR. Shock therapy, in economics, sudden withdrawal of currency and price controls over markets and fast trade liberalization, privatization, and cuts in social spending. V. Putin, current President of Russia and former KGB officer in the USSR. Elected as president after 2000. D. Xiaoping, renowned for his market economy reforms, chair of Chinese Communist Party from 1978 to 1989. Main history of Eastern Europe and Russian societies. Russia and Eastern European history mainly differs from western part of the continent through its geographic, demographic and social conditions. While Western Europe began to enter into capitalism and its market economy around 16th century onwards, the social relationships in eastern part were not very conducive for broad market transactions. First, agriculture was not very productive in the East, and in order to compete with Western merchants and states, feudal rulers in Eastern Europe mostly chose to increase the burden of work and taxes over their serfs. At that turning point in history, as market economy encouraged the development of civil initiatives and independent capital accumulation against feudal rulers in the West, general population in the East vastly suffered from growing pressure and restrictions on social and economic areas by their feudal landlords. Especially after the Industrial Revolution and overseas investments by Western capitalism, one can argue that there emerged a significant gap between two sides of the continent. The basic features of socialist economies. Basically, socialist system, starting in the USSR, aimed to abolish the dominance of private property and capitalist logic in social relationships of production. Socialist systems, by nationalizing or instituting social ownership over factories, machines, mines, energy resources etc., tried to transfer these vast resources of their home countries to the working class or majority of the population. USSR even collectivized agriculture and ended the private property's role in peasant life. All these economic decisions in socialist systems were taken by what they called planning departments of respective governments. Though they progressed visibly until 1970s, system began to suffer from inefficiency and lack of democratic participation by the people after that date. 1980s were symbolized with stagnation of socialist system and lack of innovative reforms in these societies ended up with the total collapse of socialist experiment at the end of that decade. Reasons why the system collapsed in 1980s. Socialist systems were stagnating after 1970s in terms of economic and technological growth rates. Also political pressures that were emanating from lack of democracy and freedom of speech for the ordinary population increased as the system's political legitimacy greatly depended on the ability of communist parties to provide social welfare. Volatilities in supplies of consumer goods, rising queues in state stores and inefficient bureaucratic structure of party planning were the main economic and social complaints of general population. From Lech Wales's Solidarity movement in Poland to reformist Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe was under sustained calls for major reforms in the socialist system. Though Gorbachev encouraged political and economic liberalization through his glasnost and perestroika policies, those reform attempts divided the ruling bureaucracy into reformist and conservative camps. Conservatives in the KGB even tried a military coup in 1991 to prevent the further dissolution of the Soviet Union under political and economic liberalization, but they were unsuccessful. Calls for reforms in Eastern Europe also created major demonstrations and social movements against the ruling parties. Beginning from 1989, most of the Eastern European communist governments collapsed as they could no longer respond to the political demands of their populations. The main transition problems in Eastern European economies. In terms of economic problems that Eastern European economies encountered during the transition to market economy, biggest issue was the lack of institutional framework. Eastern Europe populations did not have experiences with widespread market operations and associated legal regulations. For example, how to protect the private property rights of corporations and individuals after decades of communist era was not easy. In addition to that, economic policies that were advised by the IMF like privatization of state assets did not have necessary regulations that may prevent any plundering of public wealth during transition period. Also fast implementation of structural adjustment programs, i.e. shock therapy, created mafia-like organizations, who took advantage of those legal loopholes and even threatened the small property owners in the aftermath of the collapse of socialism. Countries, who politically controlled the market economy reform process achieved much stable results compared to hasty reform application of Russia in the 1990s. The main transition problems in Eastern European politics. The main controversy that Eastern European countries faced during 1990s was the general political apathy of the population. This political apathy was fed by population's general suspicions regarding political parties and governments in general. Widespread secret service activities and strict authoritarian measures those single-party governments applied in most of their time not only restricts civil society initiatives but also people's belief in free speech. That political apathy created a kind of double-behaving citizens, in which people tend to conceal their true opinions within public, while they continued to have oppositional views in private. For example, in Poland, Czechoslovakia, or in Hungary, main opposition groups and leaders prefer not to associate themselves with party identity. They identified themselves more as social movements, forums, or platforms. Another problem that we can point out in Eastern Europe was the issue of writing constitutions for the new era. Countries like Czech Republic and Poland were not prepared to smoothly enter into a new system since they tried this political transition through old system's constitution. Hungary surpassed this problem when they first tackled with writing a new constitution and then went into elections. Main issues related to China's transition to a market economy. In 1980s, when China ended Mao's era of autarkic and isolationist economic policies and opened up the country's economy into foreign investment, its main disadvantage was lack of technology, proper industrialization, and huge peasant population. But Xiaoping used that huge pool of labor force as an attractive cheap labor source for transnational corporations. Aside from that, Chinese Communist Party, as opposed to Eastern Europe and Russian example, chose to control transition to market economy politically. So, like their oppression of Tiananmen demonstrators, Chinese ruling party was adamantly reject political liberalization or multi-party system. China was exceptionally good at using Western technology that came into their country during 1990s. Chinese ruling elite also privatized only the smaller and unproductive state enterprises, while they kept the bigger state monopolies on telecommunication, energy, mining, and transportation areas. Latest Chinese project of One Belt One Road investment initiative was a sign that China became a significant player in global economy, as this project visibly confronted with American hegemony in world economy. The reason of Eastern Europe's relative underdevelopment: strict feudal rules over serfs. Western European industrialization before Eastern Europe. Underdeveloped civil society in Eastern Europe. Geographic conditions that were not very useful for farming. Development of income levels of general population can be the success of socialist countries. In 1970s, industrial and economic stagnation made the greatest influence on socialist economies. Before Glasnost and Perestroika. Demands for political liberalization in the USSR. Need of economic reforms for economic stagnation. Authoritarian structure of Soviet state. Mikhail Gorbachev's reformist aims. Romania changed its regime after major uprising across its cities. Hungarian negotiations for a new constitution before elections can be counted as an example of smooth transition to democracy. The shock therapy economic policies in 1990s, cutting of social spending by the state and severe austerity policies. The most important problem of Eastern Europe in transition to democracy is lack of civil society and freedom of organization among the population. A major result of 2008 economic crisis in Eastern Europe was major debt burden and need for austerity policies. China mainly differs from Eastern Europe in transition because of Communist Party's total control over political processes. The reasons of authoritarian political culture in the Eastern Europe and Russia. Countries of Eastern Europe and Russia generally suffered from economic backwardness compared to Western Europe. These countries were struggling with feudal restrictions, while Western European nations, led by England, developed the seeds of capitalism and industrialization. From 1649 English Revolution to events of 1789 in France, Europe saw the development of citizenship rights and civic participation into politics. In eastern side of the continent, feudal lords and monarchs increased the burdens and taxes of their serfs in order to compete with the rising power of the Western European countries. Those further restrictions over societies were not very conducive for the development of civic participation into politics. Also, until the October 1917 revolution, Eastern Europe did not see a major public uprising against rulers regarding political and economic rights. The main advantages and disadvantages of socialist economies compared to Western economies. Socialist economies tried to prevent economic instabilities like high inflation, unemployment, and income inequalities through abolishing private ownership over the means of production. Then they created a command economy, in which major and minor decisions about the economic life were taken by the planning commissions of state. Though socialist planning increased the welfare of people in the first 50 years until 1980s, it faced rising obstacles at the end of 1970s as socialist economies left behind in technological innovation and producing more consumer goods. Western officials argued that lack of incentives for innovation for individuals in socialist systems mostly resulted with bureaucratic inefficiency. Also, lack of participation by the people into political and economic decision-making through those 7 decades further weakened the efficient operation of socialist planning. Mikhail Gorbachev, as a reformist leader, introduced glasnost and perestroika policies in mid-1980s in order to solve long-remaining problems of Soviet economy and politics. His reforms were not welcomed by KGB and upper echelons of the army, since these reform policies decreased the party and bureaucracy's control over economic and political life. Liberal-minded economists criticized his reforms as not enough to save the declining economy from its inefficient operations. These two groups mostly struggled during early 1990s for the fate of the USSR, and with the Yeltsin's final victory we can argue that liberal-minded economists got the upper hand, as the last coup attempt of conservative bureaucrats in August 1991 did not get any serious support from the public. Gorbachev lost the control of his reform policies because he did not predict how fast the events could take over his reform policies after almost 70 years of authoritarian rule by the single party. Our institutionalist writers write about the economic transition period in former socialist countries. Institutionalist writers like Ellman and Hedlund argued that, during transition period to market economy, former socialist countries' rulers mostly ignored the lack of institutional capacity of their economic structures. For example, sectors like services and private sector culture in providing services were almost non-existent, as socialist economies tend to neglect service sector compared to industry and agriculture. Also, in socialist economies there were almost no regulations that can arrange private sector behavior in economy. One-party rule under communist years usually looked at civil initiatives suspiciously and as a potential threat to the political rule of the single party. So, institutionally one can argue that these countries need a widespread restructuring in medium term to adapt themselves to the requirements of market economy. Even IMF experts who advised shock therapy to Russia in 1990s missed this subject regarding institutional capacity, when they thought that former socialist economies could easily build market economy structures. Did political apathy a problem for the countries in transition? In most of the former socialist countries, political transition period showed that the lack of civil society organizations, problems with freedom of speech and organization, strict authoritarian pressure over population, all had negatively affected people's perceptions about politics. Official politics were shunned as populations learned not to rely on their fellow citizens within the framework of widespread secret police presence in authoritarian regimes. As Putnam observed, one of the significant issues that increase the social capital of a society is the confidence that the citizens feel when they interact with their own fellow citizens. When civic participation surges in ordinary life experiences of the population, they feel more empowered in terms of their political efficacy. Socialist governments, though began with the promise of much wider democratization of official politics, ended up with bureaucratic authoritarianism which restricted the potentials of their citizens. Why China is economically more successful in the transition process. First thing related to China's experiences in the last 3 decades is the fact that it started from a more backward point in comparison with other socialist economies. Poverty, lack of both industrialization and urban development were important problems of China even in early 1980s. Opening up of China to foreign market operations after 1978 mainly closed this gap, and country began to surpass other emerging market economies in the first decade of 21st century. At that point China used its enormous labor force that can be mobilized for industrial production, as the country contains almost a third of world's workforce. In addition to above arguments, one can count the existence of state control over strategic sectors in China as another fact that made Chinese transition more successful. Unlike hasty privatizations of 90s Eastern European economies, Chinese ruling party preferred to control important sectors, such as telecommunication, energy, transportation, and opted to privatize the most unproductive state enterprises. Also, Chinese ability to learn industrial design and production techniques from foreign corporations helped countries' economic development. Though, these Chinese practices were a lot of times accused by Western countries for being unfair trade operations.